The morning of the wedding, the great hall of Ashford Park smelled of hothouse lilies and cold ambition. There were 140 guests already seated in the south chapel when the footman with the silver tray slipped through the servants' corridor and took his place near the back wall beside two other liveried men. He was taller than the others by several inches, and his dark hair was dressed without powder, which was perhaps a small eccentricity among the serving staff. His coat was plain dark wool, the brass buttons dull where the others gleamed. He held the tray with a steadiness that did not quite match the practiced neutrality of a man who had carried trays since boyhood. Nobody looked at him. That was the point, of course. That was always the point. The bride had not yet descended. The groom had not yet appeared. The guests murmured among themselves about the floral arrangements, about the length of the sermon they anticipated from the curate, about whether Lady Vane's niece would finally secure that Scottish lord before the autumn, and not one of them thought to study the tall footman standing at the east wall as if he had always stood there, as if a footman at the east wall was simply a feature of the chapel, no more notable than the stone columns or the banked candles in their iron stands. Cecily Hartwood, who was seated in the third pew on the left, because the third pew on the left was precisely where a companion to the Dowager Duchess was expected to sit, watched the tall footman the way she watched everything at Ashford Park. Quietly. Completely. With the slight lift of awareness that had been her primary instrument of survival for the 9 months she had lived in this house. She watched him, not because she suspected him of anything. She watched him because the watching had become a kind of habit, a way of keeping the whole machinery of the house within reach, so that she might anticipate what Lady Vane required before Lady Vane required it, and because keeping her attention occupied was the only reliable method she had found to manage the slow, cold dread that had been settling in her chest since the morning Lavinia Quayle's engagement had been announced in the drawing-room over a very fine pot of tea. Her hands rested in her lap over a small card of ivory paper that had arrived under her door before dawn. She had read it 4 times. She did not entirely believe what was written on it. She believed, however, that she had been asked to watch. And she believed, because 9 months of close observation had taught her to believe it, that the man who had written to her did not ask things without purpose. The tall footman turned his head very slightly toward the third pew on the left. His eyes, at this distance, across the candle-lit length of the chapel, were the particular gray-green she had been careful not to think about for 9 months. Cecily looked down at the ivory card between her gloved fingers and slid it beneath the cuff against her wrist, where it pressed like a warm and inexplicable fact against the pulse. She did not know, not yet, what she was being asked to remember. She would watch. She had been watching. And she would watch now. And she would understand it afterward. Because that was how it had always worked between them. The thing came first. And the understanding followed. And the interval between was where she had spent most of the past 9 months. If she had imagined arriving at Ashford Park in October of the previous year with 1 trunk and a determination to be equal to whatever the household required, that the primary difficulty of her position would prove to be the Duke himself, she would have been told that she was very foolish, and she would have been right. The carriage that had brought her up the long drive from Kingsham had crested the ridge and put the estate in view through the window, just as the light was going, and what she had seen was a gray stone house of considerable size, sitting in the rolling countryside of the Somerset border, surrounded at that season by bare-limbed trees and fields gone to rust, and the last of the late asters in the walled garden near the east wing. It was not beautiful in the way fashionable houses were beautiful. It was the kind of beauty that had nothing to prove, which is a rarer kind, and often more unsettling. She had known 4 things about the Duke of Ashford before she arrived. He had inherited the title at 31 after his elder brother's sudden death from a fever. He was understood by polite society to be cold, efficient, and without interest in the season or its attendant requirements. He had declined 3 arranged introductions in the preceding year with a finality that the mothers of the declined young women had taken almost as a personal remark about their daughters. And he was, by every account she had encountered in the 3 weeks between her engagement as companion and her arrival, not a man given to sentiment. She had accepted these 4 facts as working tools and arrived prepared to be invisible, which was the fundamental skill of her position. She had been shown to a room in the east wing that was clean and cold and looked out over the kitchen garden. The housemaid Martha, who was 17 and had a laugh like a startled bird, had brought her a small fire and a tea tray and a slice of yesterday's apple cake, which Cecily had eaten with more gratitude than she allowed to show. On her 3rd morning, carrying a stack of Lady Vane's correspondence toward the writing room, she had turned a corner of the east corridor and found herself inside 18 inches of the Duke of Ashford, who had been walking the other direction with the self-possession of a man who rarely encountered obstacles in his own corridors. They had both stopped. The correspondence had not gone anywhere, which was fortunate. He was 32. Tall, with a broadness through the shoulders that his tailcoat fit precisely, as if it had been designed with no other function in mind. His face was angular and composed, with a jaw she might have described as resolute, and a quality of attention in his eyes that suggested he was very rarely looking at anything without thinking about it at the same time. The eyes themselves were an unsettling gray-green. "Miss Hartwood," he said, because his mother had apparently supplied him with the details of the new arrangement. "Your Grace," she said, and moved to the side of the corridor. He passed. She continued to the writing room. Her heart had not entirely settled by the time she reached the desk, which she noted as a fact about the situation and set aside. To Lady Vane's guests, across the months that followed, Cecily was simply the young woman who attended the dowager. She was useful at correspondence. She was present at dinner and never said too much or too little. She had a certain quality of quiet that Lady Vane had noted approvingly in their first week. Described to a friend at tea as she does not exceed her situation, which Cecily had heard from the sideboard where she was arranging the sugar bowl and had recognized as the intended compliment it was, and also as a verdict about the ceiling above which she was not expected to reach. The friend had looked at her across the room and said, "A pity she has no family." Lady Vane had said, with the specific flattening of voice that served her as agreement, "None that signify." Cecily had placed the sugar bowl very precisely at the corner of the tray. She had been in situations where people spoke of worth the way merchants speak of inventory. She had learned to manage the sensation that came with it, which was not quite grief and not quite anger, but occupied the territory between the two in the particular way of things that have not been named. She managed it by noting what was in the room, and what it meant, and what came next, and the next thing to come. That October was the gradual and undeniable accumulation of the Duke's attention. It was not dramatic. He did not single her out. He did not seek her company in any way that could have been observed and commented upon by even the most industrious of Lady Vane's correspondents. What he did was smaller than that, and more difficult to dismiss. He inquired once, passing her in the corridor outside the morning room where she had been reading, whether she had found the library adequate. She said she had, "Thank you, Your Grace." He said the collection in the upper gallery was more extensive and that she was welcome to use it. He said this while his gaze moved to the volume in her hands for precisely 2 seconds and then away, and she thought, because he had not commented on the title, that he had not particularly noticed what she was reading. She was wrong about that. 2 weeks later, when she went to the upper gallery to explore the collection, She found that the gap on the lower library shelf where her particular volume had resided was now where a gap ought to be, and the volume itself had migrated to the upper gallery. The move was recent enough that the dust had not yet resettled. She stood in the upper gallery for a moment with this information. The gap on the lower shelf was narrow, 2 fingers wide at most, the kind of gap a housekeeper would have filled at once if the volume had been misplaced rather than moved with intention. She ran 1 finger along the edge of it. In the lower library, as if the absence might tell her something the presence of the book could not, she did not permit herself to conclude anything. She went to the upper gallery and found the volume precisely where it would have been placed if someone had wished to ensure she had access to a better copy. And she sat in the chair near the tall window and opened to the page she had left and read, because it was what she had come to do, and because drawing conclusions from the redistribution of a library was not a thing a sensible person permitted herself. She was, she had found, a sensible person in most areas of her life. She was working carefully on this one. The December house party brought 18 guests, and the first appearance of Lavinia Quayle. Lavinia was 22 and genuinely pretty in the particular way of women who have been told they are pretty since girlhood and have absorbed the information without becoming foolish about it. She had dark hair and a confident bearing, and a dowry that, according to the fragment of conversation Cecily had overheard between Lady Vane and the Quayle mother, was considerable. She surveyed Ashford Park on her arrival, with the quick, satisfied attention of someone checking a property against its description and finding the details accurate. She spoke to the Duke at dinner on the first evening with the warmth of a woman who has been well prepared and intends to perform her role with distinction. The Duke had responded to Lavinia's warmth with the same level precision he brought to every conversation. He had listened. He had asked questions that were reasonable and showed he had attended to what she said. He had not, as far as Cecily could observe from the appropriate distance, produced a single expression that suggested he was in the company of someone he found necessary. On the 28th of December, Cecily had gone to the upper gallery in the evening to return a volume she had finished, and she had found the Duke standing at the window that looked out over the snowy grounds, in the particular way he sometimes occupied a room when he believed himself alone. His back was to the door. The room was lit by 2 candles on the table near the shelves, and the light from the snowy grounds outside made the window bright in a way that threw his face, in profile, into a clarity she had not intended to see. His expression was not peaceful. It was not resigned. It was the expression of a man who has been looking for something for a long time and has begun, with a particular quiet grief, to doubt whether the search is the right one. She had started to withdraw, and he had heard her and turned, and the expression had closed with the same efficiency with which he managed everything. She said, "Forgive me, Your Grace. I will return the volume tomorrow." He said, "You are not interrupting anything." A silence had settled in the gallery. Outside, the snow was still falling in long, slow curtains against the dark. He said, without quite looking at her, "How is your father's estate managing? With the cold?" The question was so unexpected that for a moment she had not followed it. Then she understood that he had been told, or had asked, or had observed from some detail she could not identify, that her father's estate in Devonshire had been sold in August, that the house was gone, that there was no estate to manage, and had not been for 4 months. She said, "The estate was sold in August, Your Grace." He looked at her then, directly. "I know," he said quietly. She understood from the way he said it that he had known before he asked, and that the question had been, in its careful way, an invitation for her to speak of it if she chose. She did not choose. She thanked him and took her leave, and walked back through the corridors with the strange sensation of having been seen in a way she had not authorized, and had not, she found, resented. The engagement was announced in February, officially, in a letter from the Duke's solicitor to the Quayle family's solicitor, and unofficially in the drawing room over a very fine pot of tea when Lady Vane told Cecily to write it into the household correspondence diary. Lady Vane received it with the satisfied finality of a woman whose long plan has reached its proper conclusion, and the household rearranged itself around the fact of a future duchess who was not yet present, and whose coming transformed the available air in every room she was discussed in. Cecily managed it. She arranged flowers. She attended calls. She managed the correspondence. She did not examine very closely the particular quality of the cold that had settled in her chest at the announcement, because examining it would have required naming it, and naming it would have served no purpose she could justify. What she could not entirely manage was the continuing presence of his particular attentions. He had not changed. The corridor door held at the turn of the east passage. The quiet inquiry about the history in 2 volumes she had been reading since January. The March morning when he had come upon her in the archive room attempting to shift a box of his mother's old correspondence, and had simply lifted it himself, without comment, and set it where it needed to go, and then stood for a moment in the dusty quiet of the archive, as if there was something he intended to say and had decided against. She had said, "Your Grace." The houseman could have been sent. He had said, "You were here," and left. She had stood in the archive with the dust settling around her and held herself very still while she considered, with the care she brought to every situation that required care, that she was precisely equal to her position and precisely not equal to the thing she had been not naming for 4 months. In the 3rd week of April, the card had arrived under her door before dawn. Plain ivory stock, his hand, the same level, unornamented script. "I intend to take a measure before the wedding that will require a witness. I ask for your help and your discretion. I ask that you come to the study at 9 o'clock this evening. I will explain the rest when you arrive." She had gone because she was not, whatever else she was, a coward. He had been standing at the window when she entered, which was where she had most often found him, when she had not expected to find him anywhere in particular. He turned when she came in. The fire had burned to a settled glow, and the room had the quality of a place where things said would be weighed carefully before they were spoken. He said, "I am grateful you came." She stood near the door in a way that communicated nothing about what she was feeling, because she had become very good at this. He went to the desk and stood behind it with his hands flat on the surface, not leaning on it, but touching it, and she understood that this was as close to bracing himself as he came. "I have watched," he said, "for some time, how people address me in this house, how they address me in London, how arrangements are made around me by persons who are genuinely certain they know what I require, because they have decided that what I require and what will best serve the family's position are the same calculation." He looked at the fire. "I have come to believe they are wrong. I have come to believe that if I were not the Duke of Ashford, but merely a man of moderate means and no title, several important persons in this household would find that their present warmth required revision." Cecily said, "You mean to discover which of them would revise it?" He looked at her. "Yes." He told her the rest plainly. He would attend his own wedding in a footman's livery. He would move through the chapel and the wedding breakfast as a servant. He would observe. He wanted her to observe as well, from her position in the 3rd pew, because she noticed things that other people did not, and because he trusted her account of what she saw. She had said then, "And what do you expect to see?" He said, "I expect to see clearly." for once in my life." His voice did not change in register, but there was something underneath it that she recognized, because she had felt it herself. "I have been surrounded by arrangements my entire life. Arrangements for what I should do and who I should do it with, and what the household requires, and what the family requires, and what the season requires. I have never been in a room where I was not, in some essential way, a title, rather than a man." A silence. The fire spoke softly. He said, "I have observed you for 9 months in this house. You know what I mean. You know the particular experience of being in a room where you are a function rather than a person." She said, slowly, "Yes." He said, "I thought you might." She understood then the quiet grief she had seen at the window in December. She understood the thing he had not said, which was that she was the only person in his household who had ever spoken to him as if what he said was the thing she was attending to, rather than the position from which he said it. She said, "I will watch." He said, "Thank you." And there was something in the simplicity of it that she did not examine that evening, but lay awake with for a considerable time afterward. The 3 weeks before the wedding she thought of as the 3 weeks of the particular dread, because she understood now what she was watching and why it mattered and what she felt about it, which were 3 things she had been not naming for varying lengths of time, and which had, under the pressure of the ivory card and the study and the firelight and the look on his face when he said for once, combined into a single clear and inconvenient fact. She was in love with the Duke of Ashford. She was a companion with no family that signified £15 per annum and a room in the East Wing. She was exactly equal to her situation, and not remotely equal to this. And she had 3 weeks in which to manage it before the wedding, after which she would need to consider what to do next. She spent those 3 weeks doing exactly what she had been asked to do. She watched. Lavinia arrived 10 days before the wedding, with her mother and a lady's maid, and 7 trunks that suggested a thorough understanding of the wardrobe requirements of a future duchess. She was gracious in the particular way of women who have been prepared. She surveyed the state rooms with the measured satisfaction of someone checking accounts she had been shown but not yet owned. She spoke to the Duke with an accomplished warmth, clear and even and carefully calibrated to the role without exceeding it in any direction that might look like feeling. She spoke to Cecily in the register one uses with a companion, which is not unkind and is not warm, and is simply the register appropriate to that relationship, as a register in the correct key is not a criticism of the others. On the 6th day of her visit, Lavinia's mother had been speaking in the green sitting room with Lady Vane, and Cecily had been arranging the tea things at the sideboard because Lady Vane found her presence calming in the mornings. The topic of household management had arisen, and the topic of certain members of the household. The companion, Lady Vane's friend, had said, the one from Devonshire. Lady Vane had said, yes. A pause, in which Lavinia's mother made some small sound of inquiry. Lady Vane had said, she has done well enough for what she is. A plain sort of girl, really. Not the kind to trouble anyone. This was the 3rd time someone had found occasion to account for her plainness in a room she was standing in, and she placed the final cup on the tray with a steadiness she was proud of. The morning of the wedding, she dressed in the dark blue wool and pinned her mother's jet brooch at her collar, the small oval of polished black stone that was the only piece of jewelry she had kept through the sale of the house. She sat at the writing table with the ivory card and read it one final time. I ask only that you watch, and that you remember what you see. She folded it along its crease and slid it beneath her glove. The South Chapel filled with 140 people, wearing the finest clothes the season had produced. The flowers were white and fragrant and almost extravagant in their quantity. The organ was playing something stately that Cecily did not recognize. She took the third pew on the left, as she always took the third pew on the left, and she watched the east wall. He was already there. She had not been certain she would be able to distinguish him at such a distance, in livery, among other men in livery. But she had known she would, and she did, because she had been watching the edges of rooms where he was for 9 months, and had learned his particular quality of stillness, the way one learns any language that one has had sufficient reason to study. He did not look at her immediately. He stood with the tray and was a footman. He was entirely a footman. And the completeness of the performance was what moved through her most quietly, the understanding that he had done this, put on another man's coat, and stood where the invisible stood, because he had needed to know the truth of his own life badly enough to risk the considerable mortification of being discovered. He moved through the chapel's perimeter as the guests arrived, receiving empty glasses, keeping his eyes forward, and not one person's gaze paused on him in the way gaze pauses on a person it recognizes. Not one. 140 people who ate at his table and sought his patronage and depended on his goodwill looked at a man in a plain wool coat and saw a coat. She pressed her thumb against the card at her wrist and held herself very still, and she understood, watching, the full weight of what he had said in the study. He had been in rooms all his life and had never once been simply present in them. Lavinia descended the aisle in ivory silk and Brussels lace and was genuinely beautiful, which Cecily noted, and which did not help. The curate read the service. The vows were spoken. The man at the altar spoke in the level, precise voice she recognized, and Cecily felt the ivory card press against her pulse and kept her face perfectly still, and thought, "You are watching. This is what you were asked to do." The room afterward was bright and warm with the relief of a ceremony completed. The wedding breakfast was laid in the great hall. The company made its happy noise. 20 minutes into the wedding breakfast, the servants' corridor opened, and the Duke of Ashford walked in wearing his own coat. He did not hurry. He moved through the hall with the quiet authority of a man who occupies every room he enters because it is his, and because it is simply what he does. And the room turned to look at him the way rooms turn when the weather shifts. Not because anyone decided to look, but because something had changed in the atmosphere, and the body knows before the mind. Lavinia stood near the window with her mother and Lord Greaves, and Cecily watched her face change when she saw him enter. The change was very quick, the kind that crosses a trained face before it can be recalled. And if Cecily had not been watching precisely, she would have missed it. It was not love. She was certain. With the certainty of 9 months of careful observation and the particular education of a woman who has had to learn to read rooms in order to survive them, that it was not love. It was the recalibration of a person who has constructed a plan with great care and has just discovered a variable she had not controlled for. It was honest in its way. It was not contemptible. It was simply not the thing that was supposed to be standing in a wedding chapel on a spring morning in full view of 140 witnesses. The thing that was supposed to be standing there in the only form that mattered had spent 4 hours at the east wall in a footman's coat, and she had not once looked at it. He walked to his mother. Lady Vane said very quietly, "What is the meaning of this?" He said, "I have spent the last 4 hours in this room and in that chapel, and I have learned what I needed to learn." His voice was level and even, and entirely decided. "I am grateful for the lesson." A silence. Lord Greaves shifted. One of the Quayle cousins at the window looked at another. "The wedding," he said, "is not going to proceed as arranged." I will speak with Miss Quayle privately and explain my conclusions fully. I will conduct myself with every consideration she deserves. The contracts will be addressed by my solicitor, and no one will suffer by this arrangement who has not merited it." Lady Vane said, "You cannot do this." He said, "I can." He let the room hold that for a moment. He did not look toward the window. He did not look toward Lavinia. He turned and looked across the hall to the east wall, where Cecily was standing near the white draped table, and the look was the look she had been not looking at for 9 months, and she had nothing left to do with it except receive it. He walked to her. The hall watched. She was aware of it. The held breath of 140 people who had come expecting one story and were witnessing another. And all of it felt very distant compared to the fact of him stopping in front of her with the same quality of stillness that cost him more than stillness. She said, "Your Grace." He said, "Cecily." The room heard it. She felt it move through her from the wrist where the card still pressed against her pulse to somewhere she had not given him permission to reach. "I know what I have observed," he said. "I have been observing for 9 months, and I know what I observed this morning, and I know what I have been managing not to say for a considerable time, because the circumstances did not permit it." He looked at her directly. "They permit it now. I am asking whether you would allow me to call on you. Formally. With every intention that any reasonable person might infer." She was 24 years old. She had a room in the East Wing and £15 per annum. She had her mother's jet brooch and the kind of education that had made her very capable and had not otherwise served her in any way she could quantify. She said, "Yes." He said, "Thank you." And the simplicity of it was the same simplicity it had always been, the simplicity of a man who does not say more than he means. He did not take her hand. He turned back to the room with the same composure he had brought into it, and the room adjusted around this new arrangement the way rooms do when something has been established that cannot be unestablished. Lady Vane said once, to no one specifically, "You cannot mean to." She said it the way she said things she knew had already happened, which is to say with a quality of grief that she would not have called grief, but that was recognizable as such to anyone paying attention. Lavinia left the hall with the grace of someone who has understood a situation clearly and has chosen the dignified response. Her mother left slightly less gracefully, but left nonetheless. The company dispersed across the afternoon in small groups of 2s and 3s, murmuring, until the great hall was quiet, and the flowers were still, and the light was moving long and golden across the floor. He had spoken with Lavinia privately, in the library, for some time. Cecily had waited in the morning room with her hands in her lap, not reading. And when he came to find her later, his face had the quality of a man who has done something difficult, and done it correctly, and is still living inside the weight of it. He had sat across from her in the morning room and said, "She knew." Cecily said nothing. He looked at the window for a moment, where the afternoon light was still holding, pale and clear, across the stone sill. "She knew the morning she arrived," he said. "She told me, when I explained, that she had understood it was not a love match, and had intended to make the best of the arrangement, and that she wishes me well. And I believe her." He looked at his hands. "She deserves better than the best of an arrangement." Cecily said, "Yes." "So do you," he said, and looked up. The morning room was very quiet. She said, "That is perhaps for time to determine." He said, "I have time." The corner of his mouth moved in the way she had come to recognize as the thing that was not quite a smile, but was as close as he reliably came. "I have a great deal of time. I intend to use it carefully." The spring of that year moved slowly into summer at Ashford Park, and summer settled into autumn, and the formal calling proceeded exactly as he had indicated it would, with every propriety observed and Lady Vane present and largely silent in the manner of a person who is managing a revision to a long-held plan and has the dignity not to stage the revision as a scene. There were people who wrote to inquire about the situation at Ashford Park and were received by Lady Vane with a composed brevity that conveyed everything required and invited no further questions. The season's correspondents wrote their letters, and the letters were answered in terms that were neither confirmatory nor confounding. And gradually, the way gradual things happen, the question of what was occurring at Ashford Park became the kind of settled knowledge that no longer required letters to confirm it. Cecily continued to manage the correspondence and arrange the flowers and attend Lady Vane to morning calls, and the quality of those activities had changed in a way that was difficult to name and impossible to mistake. Martha had noticed it first, which was not surprising, since Martha noticed most things before they became official, and had expressed her observations by pressing every available garment in the East Wing wardrobe without being asked, and with a thoroughness that exceeded the requirements of the situation. He had called on her 4 times over the summer, and on the 4th occasion, sitting in the drawing-room in the particular slanted evening light of late August, while Lady Vane dozed quietly in her chair by the window, he had said, "I have been considering how to say this for some time." She had set down her embroidery because she could hear in his voice the quality that meant he was speaking carefully. He said, "When I went into that chapel in a footman's coat, I was looking for a clear view. I had spent 32 years in rooms where people spoke to the title, and I had concluded that if I removed the title, they would simply speak to the coat, which would tell me something accurate about the architecture of their regard." He paused. What I was not expecting was to spend 9 months developing an accurate view of someone through the ordinary daily business of a household, simply because that person was attending to the same business with the same care and had no particular investment in managing my perception of her, because she had no idea it was a perception worth managing. Cecily said nothing, because she was attending to every word. He said, "You noticed things. You noticed the library. You noticed when the mill workers' wages mattered and when they did not to the people at the table. You noticed Miss Quayle's mother's tone when she spoke to the staff, and you said nothing about it, but I saw you notice it." He looked at her steadily. "You were the only person in this house who looked at me as if the question of what you thought of me was a question about me." She said, "It was." He said, "I know." A breath. "Cecily, will you marry me?" She had been waiting, without knowing she had been waiting, for something to shift in the architecture of the moment, for the thing she had felt since the East Corridor in October to arrive at a form she could accept without reservation. It arrived now. It was not dramatic. It was simply true. She said, "Yes." Lady Vane, from the chair by the window, made a sound that was either agreement or a comment on the light, and did not open her eyes. They were married in September in the South Chapel, on a morning of late roses and the first cool clarity of the turning season. Martha had pressed Cecily's gown with more care than the gown required, and had then cried quietly in the corridor, which Cecily had noted and found she was grateful for. The small company that attended was exactly the company that wished to attend, which was a different and more valuable thing than the company that had been required to attend 6 months before. He stood at the altar in his own coat. Navy. Perfectly fitted. The coat of a man who was precisely himself, standing in front of exactly the people who had come, because they chose to. The curate read the service. The vows were spoken. She said "I do," with her hands folded in her cream silk gloves and her mother's jet brooch at her collar, the small oval of polished black stone catching the chapel light. And afterward, when they walked out through the doors into the September air, the small company behind them made the particular sound of people who had been moved by something they were glad to have witnessed. That evening, the upper gallery held the last light of the season through its long windows, and the candles burned in their stands, and the fire spoke quietly. And she sat across from him at the reading table near the window, with her book open in her hands. She had placed the ivory card on the mantelpiece that morning before she dressed, face up, so that she could see it from the chair. I ask only that you watch, and that you remember what you see. He sat across from her with a book of his own that he was not reading, and after some time he said, "What are you thinking about?" She said, "What I saw." He said nothing. He looked at the card on the mantelpiece, and then he looked at her. And neither of them said anything further, because nothing further was required. Outside in the walled garden, the last September roses held their pale color in the dark, and the fire settled into its warmth, and the card on the mantelpiece said what it had always said, and was answered, at last, by the whole quiet weight of the room around them. Thank you for spending this evening at Ashford Park. If something in this story found its way to you, leave a word below. It means more than you might imagine to be heard.